What if the CEO of a billion-dollar company disguised himself as a janitor just to see the truth? This is the story of Richard Hale, a powerful man who gave up his identity to uncover loyalty, betrayal, and the hidden hearts of his employees. What he found will shock you and inspire you. Forever, Richard Hale sat in his corner office, surrounded by glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. From this height, everything looked orderly, controlled, and distant, yet he felt the chaos beneath. Despite leading a multi-billion-dollar corporation, he could not ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. His empire was growing, but so were the whispers of betrayal. Success, he realized, could be both a crown and a chain. He remembered the early days when he had built the company from scratch, fueled by ambition and endless nights of work. Back then, trust meant everything, and loyalty was the only currency he valued. Now, as the company expanded, layers of hierarchy separated him from the very people he had once worked beside. The faces in the boardroom smiled at him, but he wondered how many wore masks. Reports of irregularities had reached him quietly, through rumors and subtle hints. His auditors claimed everything was in order, but Richard's instincts told him otherwise. A fortune of this scale attracted ambition, envy, and betrayal. He knew money was a magnet for both loyalty and deceit, and he could no longer distinguish one from the other. The loneliness of power pressed heavily on his shoulders. Every decision was his to make, yet every mistake was his to bear alone. Even his most trusted executives began to feel like strangers. Did they truly respect him, or did they only serve the wealth he represented? The doubt gnawed at his confidence. Richard's eyes wandered across the office, landing on a framed photo of his younger self, an ambitious man with dirt on his hands, working tirelessly to prove himself. He missed that man, the one who understood the ground level, who lived among the people instead of above them. Somewhere along the way, he had become a symbol rather than a human being. As evening fell, the office emptied, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. The city lights blinked like scattered stars, and yet he felt no warmth in them. Success had built him walls instead of bridges, and now he wanted to break through them. The more he thought, the clearer it became. He could no longer trust the view from the top. He replayed conversations in his head, the insincere compliments, the exaggerated laughter, the careful words spoken in his presence. It was theater, and he was the audience. He longed to hear what was said when the curtains closed, when people thought no one important was listening. Only then, he thought, would the truth surface. The pressure had been mounting for months, and tonight it reached a boiling point. Richard clenched his fists, his reflection in the glass wall staring back at him with quiet intensity. Something had to change. He could not keep ruling blindly, dependent on half-truths and false loyalty. As he sat in silence, a radical thought emerged. What if he abandoned the role of CEO, at least temporarily? What if he could walk among his employees unseen, stripped of power and prestige? To see the company not as Richard Hale, the billionaire, but as a simple man with no authority. The idea electrified him, dangerous, perhaps reckless, but liberating, to discover who truly respected people for who they were and who lived only for ambition. That night, Richard decided he would go undercover, not as an executive, not as a consultant, but as the lowest rank of all, a janitor. And just like Richard, sometimes we all wonder who truly stands by our side. If you've ever felt that way, take a moment to join this journey with us. Subscribe to the channel and walk with us through stories that inspire, challenge, and reveal the true meaning of trust. The next morning, Richard arrived at work carrying a secret no one could suspect. He moved through the lobby, past employees who greeted him with bright, rehearsed smiles. He looked at them differently now, wondering how many faces would change once his title vanished. Power, he knew, could blind people to their own truth. Later that day, Richard sat at the long boardroom table, listening to polished reports from his executives. Graphs, charts, and projections filled the screens, but none of them answered the question in his heart. Who was loyal, and who was waiting for him to fail? He searched their eyes for answers, but found only reflections of ambition. Mark, one of his senior managers, spoke with confidence, his voice smooth like oil. He praised Richard's leadership, but beneath the compliments, Richard sensed calculation. Sarah, the young intern seated quietly in the corner, scribbled notes with genuine focus. Her presence was small, yet she radiated a sincerity the others lacked. When the meeting ended, Richard stayed behind, staring at the empty chairs. The polished mahogany table reflected his troubled face. He had built this empire, but now it felt alien to him. His employees lived in the same building, yet in different worlds, one of privilege, the other of invisibility. He wondered which world held the truth. That evening, Richard called upon a trusted disguise artist who had worked in theater. Within hours, his sharp suit and commanding presence disappeared under baggy overalls, worn shoes, and a mop bucket. His hair was grayed, his face roughened, his posture bent. Looking in the mirror, he no longer saw a billionaire CEO. He saw a man no one would notice. The plan was risky. If exposed, he could face humiliation, even scandal. The press would feast on the story of a paranoid CEO spying on his employees. But Richard was ready to take the risk. Truth, he believed, was worth more than reputation. The first step was simple: begin as the night janitor. Few would pay attention to him, and fewer still would question his presence. He would clean the very floors he once walked as a king. The irony was not lost on him. From luxury to labor, his journey had come full circle. That night, Richard entered the building dressed as George the janitor. The security guard glanced at him once and waved him through without a word. Already he was invisible. The walls that once mirrored his power now ignored him entirely. As he pushed the mop across the marble floor, Richard felt a strange freedom. The weight of the CEO title had vanished. Now, he was just another worker, unseen and underestimated. For the first time in years, he could observe without being observed. But as he worked, he overheard a conversation down the hall, voices sharp, impatient, and careless. He froze, mop in hand, realizing this was exactly what he had been searching for. The masks were already slipping. Richard's reflection in the mirror no longer showed the polished billionaire who commanded respect. Instead, an aging janitor stared back, complete with sagging clothes and worn-out shoes. The disguise was astonishingly effective. His posture slouched, his hair tinted gray, and his eyes dulled behind thick glasses. He practiced his new voice, lowering its pitch, adding a rasp that hid his natural authority. The man who once walked with power now looked like someone invisible. He chose the name George, a simple and unremarkable identity that carried no weight. George had no fortune, no influence, and no prestige, only a mop and bucket. Richard rehearsed the role in his mind, imagining how a janitor might speak, how he might carry himself when others barely noticed. To succeed, he needed to forget Richard Hale and embody George completely. The first morning of his official undercover role was surreal. Richard walked into the building through the service entrance, a door he had never used in his life. No one looked twice as he clocked in beside other janitors, their tired faces reflecting lives of quiet endurance. He felt humbled, realizing how little he knew of their world, despite owning the company they cleaned for. Assigned to the lower floors, Richard began his work. The smell of bleach filled his lungs and sweat dampened his disguise. Every stroke of the mop reminded him of how far he had descended from the glass towers of leadership. Yet there was an odd satisfaction in the simplicity of the task. The marble floors gleamed under his care, unnoticed by those who walked over them. By mid-morning, he understood the first truth of his journey. Invisibility was both a curse and a gift. Employees brushed past him without acknowledgement, talking freely as if he were furniture. This was his window into their unfiltered selves, a chance to observe raw honesty. For the first time, Richard realized he held more power as George than as CEO. George quickly discovered the harsh reality of invisibility. Within hours, he experienced the casual dismissals and cold stares that janitors endured daily. A manager barked at him to move faster, while others ignored him completely. The contrast was striking yesterday. People treated him with reverence. Today, he was beneath their notice. This shift pierced Richard's heart, revealing how shallow respect could be. He also witnessed the small cruelties that often went unseen. Employees dropped trash on the floor without apology, assuming someone like him would clean it up without complaint. One worker mocked his slow movements, while another complained about lazy janitors within earshot. Richard bit his tongue, fighting the urge to break character and reveal who he truly was. Humility, he realized, was the price of truth. Yet among the indifference, kindness still flickered. Sarah, the intern he had noticed before, greeted him with a warm smile. She thanked him for his work, even handing him a bottle of water on a particularly exhausting afternoon. To her, George was not invisible. That small act of humanity shone brighter than any polished boardroom speech he had ever heard. Late in the evening, as the office quieted, Richard overheard conversations he never would have caught as CEO. Managers complained about their bosses, some mocked their subordinates, and others hinted at financial shortcuts. The walls of the company whispered with secrets, and George was the unseen witness. He scribbled notes in a small pocket journal, determined to piece together the hidden truths. By the end of his first week, Richard understood the depth of his disguise. The world of janitors was heavy with labor, yet light on recognition. But within this world, he found a lens into the true nature of his employees. The shadows revealed more than the light ever could, and Richard felt he was only at the beginning of what he would uncover. The days passed, and George settled into the rhythm of janitorial life. His hands, once used to signing contracts, now scrubbed stains from carpets and polished glass doors. The physical toll was heavier than he expected, leaving his back aching at night. Yet it gave him a new respect for the invisible workforce that kept the company alive. They worked tirelessly, unnoticed, but essential. He quickly noticed the hierarchy of disdain that flowed downward. Executives dismissed managers, managers dismissed staff, and staff dismissed janitors. Respect was often given based on title, not on character. George realized the corporate ladder was not only about ambition, but also about who people felt entitled to step on. This truth disturbed him deeply. Richard also observed conversations employees would never dare have around the real CEO. He overheard crude jokes about leadership, whispered strategies for climbing the ladder, and even discussions about cutting corners on projects. The honesty was raw, unfiltered, and sometimes ugly. Power, it seemed, only encouraged people to hide their real thoughts. Despite the darkness, he noticed moments of light. A few workers offered him help carrying heavy bags, and others greeted him kindly. Their small gestures stood out like stars in a cold night sky. Richard clung to these acts of humanity, realizing that kindness often emerged most clearly when directed at those without power. By the end of the week, he understood just how divided his empire truly was. The boardroom presented unity and professionalism, but the ground level revealed fractures, resentment, and ambition unchecked. The harsh reality struck him with more force than any financial report could. His company's true foundation wasn't money, it was people, and many of them were broken. One evening, exhausted after hours of mopping, George nearly stumbled carrying a heavy trash bin. Before he could regain his balance, Sarah, the young intern, rushed over to help him. Unlike others who barely acknowledged him, she treated him with dignity. Her gentle smile and simple words of encouragement left Richard stunned. Respect, he realized, was a choice, not a status. Sarah often stayed late, working diligently on projects with no recognition. While others dismissed her as just an intern, George noticed her dedication and quiet strength. She never complained, even when given tedious tasks by arrogant supervisors. Her resilience reminded Richard of his younger self, fighting for a place in a world that ignored him. Over time, Sarah began to speak with George more freely. She asked about his life, though he kept his answers vague to protect his disguise. Still, she thanked him daily for his work, insisting the office would crumble without people like him. To Richard, her gratitude felt more genuine than the flattery he received as CEO. One night, Sarah offered him a bottle of water and half of her sandwich, claiming she had packed too much food. Richard was moved, realizing she shared what little she had, while executives hoarded wealth and recognition. Her kindness wasn't calculated, it was natural. In Sarah, he saw the kind of employee and person his company desperately needed. From that moment, Richard knew Sarah was different. She became his silent anchor, proof that integrity still existed within the company walls. Watching her reminded him why he had built the company in the first place, not for profit, but for people with dreams and determination. Sarah's kindness became his beacon, guiding him deeper into the truth. Late one night, while emptying bins on the executive floor, George overheard voices drifting from a half-open conference room. He froze, his broom still in hand, as the conversation grew sharper. Two managers whispered about diverted funds, falsified numbers, and secret accounts hidden from the CEO. Richard's pulse quickened. This was the confirmation of betrayal he had feared. The men laughed casually, their arrogance unmasked in the absence of authority. They mocked Richard as too blind to notice and spoke of an upcoming shift in leadership. George gripped his mop tighter, swallowing his anger. Every word was a dagger, but he knew he could not reveal himself yet. Evidence, not emotion, was his weapon now. When the men left, Richard slipped inside and scanned the table. Scattered papers revealed coded notes and initials that hinted at something larger. He memorized as much as he could before cleaning up the room to avoid suspicion. His disguise gave him a perfect shield. No one cared what a janitor saw. That invisibility was his greatest asset. Walking the empty halls, Richard's mind swirled with questions. Who was behind this? How deep did the betrayal run? He had suspected greed, but hearing it so openly confirmed the rot within his empire. For the first time, he doubted whether his company could survive without a purge of its leadership. That night, Richard made a vow to himself. He would uncover the mastermind. He would not confront shadows with anger, but with proof. The janitor's bucket and mop had become his tools of justice. And as George, he would listen, observe, and prepare for the war silently brewing inside his empire. The following week, George moved silently through the office, gathering fragments of conversations like pieces of a puzzle. Each overheard remark hinted at a conspiracy larger than he imagined. Executives met off-site under false pretenses, invoices were manipulated, and secret deals took shape in the shadows. The company he built was being stolen from under him. One night, while cleaning a break room, he found a discarded folder left behind. Inside were documents marked with initials, numbers that didn't add up, and references to hidden accounts overseas. His heart pounded as he quickly photographed the pages with a hidden phone. This was no longer suspicion, it was undeniable evidence of theft, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the situation became. George noticed certain employees watching him with narrowed eyes, as if suspecting he lingered too long in places he didn't belong. Once he returned to find his mop bucket moved, as though someone had checked his belongings. His disguise, while strong, was not invincible. Despite the risks, Richard pressed forward. Each night, he collected notes in his pocket journal, cross-referencing conversations with documents. He realized betrayal wasn't confined to a handful of greedy men. It spread like a disease through multiple levels of leadership. The empire he built on trust was cracking under the weight of deceit. Still, among the darkness, Sarah remained a reminder of what was good. She greeted him warmly, unaware of the secrets he carried. Her kindness fueled his resolve to fight for the company's honest workers. Richard now knew he wasn't just defending his fortune, he was protecting people like Sarah from the corruption threatening to consume everything. Emily, the secretary who had served the company for nearly a decade, began to notice George more than others did. While most dismissed him as invisible, she observed his quiet presence and the way his eyes seemed sharper than those of an ordinary janitor. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but small details began to trouble her. One evening, as she worked late, Emily saw George lingering near the copy machine, jotting notes after executives had left. His movements were cautious, too intentional for a man simply cleaning. Instead of confronting him, she chose to watch silently, curious about who he really was. Something about him felt both ordinary and extraordinary at once. The next night, she casually struck up a conversation with him, asking about his background. George kept his answers vague, deflecting questions with half-truths. Emily sensed he was hiding something, but unlike others, she did not mock or dismiss him. Instead, she treated him with quiet respect, almost as if she trusted her instincts more than appearances. Over the days that followed, Emily noticed George's presence at critical moments near executive meetings. in rooms where confidential papers were left unattended. Her suspicions deepened, but so did her admiration. She saw in him a man who carried secrets, not malice. She decided to keep her thoughts to herself, unsure whether to expose him or protect him. Richard, meanwhile, recognized Emily's intelligence. Her sharp eyes followed him, and though it made him uneasy, he respected her discretion. For the first time, he wondered if his secret would be uncovered not by betrayal, but by loyalty. Emily's quiet awareness was both a threat and a possible ally in the storm ahead. Among the managers Richard had observed, one stood out for his arrogance and cruelty: Mark. He belittled subordinates, mocked interns, and treated janitors like dirt under his shoes. George endured his insults in silence, each one burning Richard's pride, yet teaching him the raw truth of unchecked power. Mark was the face of everything wrong within the company. But Richard soon discovered that Mark was more than just an arrogant bully. Late one night, he overheard Mark speaking on the phone, discussing coded transactions and deadlines. The conversation revealed his involvement in the conspiracy, though he was clearly not its mastermind. Mark was a pawn, dangerous, but controlled by someone far more powerful. George followed him discreetly in the days that followed, pretending to clean hallways while noting his movements. He noticed Mark frequently meeting with higher executives in secluded offices, his demeanor shifting from arrogance to obedience. It was clear Mark wasn't the architect, he was the soldier. And soldiers, Richard knew, followed orders. The discovery infuriated him. How many others had hidden their betrayal behind polite smiles at boardroom tables? Mark's cruelty was merely a symptom of a deeper disease, one rooted at the very heart of leadership. Richard's mission was no longer about observing. It was about preparing for war against the rot consuming his empire. Still, George kept his mask. He endured Mark's insults, recorded his suspicious calls, and documented every sign of betrayal. The janitor had become the hunter, and Mark unknowingly was leading him step by step to the real enemy. The shadows were closing in, and Richard was ready to strike when the time came. Richard's suspicions narrowed as he pieced together the fragments of his investigation. Mark, for all his arrogance, lacked the intelligence to orchestrate the conspiracy. The mastermind had to be someone higher, someone Richard trusted. One night, while cleaning the executive lounge, he overheard a conversation that froze his blood. The familiar voice belonged to none other than Thomas Graves, his most trusted executive. Thomas had been with the company from its early days, a man Richard once considered a brother. Hearing him discuss the transfer of millions to offshore accounts was like a knife twisting in his chest. Thomas spoke with authority, directing others with confidence. Mark was merely his puppet, carrying out the dirty work under his command. Richard leaned against his mop, his heart pounding with betrayal. The man he had relied on for decades, the one who had celebrated every victory by his side, was plotting his downfall. Worse still, Thomas mocked him openly, describing Richard as a figurehead, too blinded by wealth to notice the empire crumbling around him. The revelation shattered Richard's last illusions about loyalty. If Thomas, his closest ally, could turn against him, then no one was beyond suspicion. Trust, he realized, was not a gift, but a gamble, and he had gambled poorly. Yet with pain came clarity. He now knew who his true enemy was. That night, Richard vowed he would not confront Thomas in anger. Instead, he would build his case carefully, recording every detail. The janitor's disguise gave him time, and time would be his weapon. To strike too soon meant failure, to wait meant victory. The game had changed, and now Richard played it with deadly focus. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on Richard as he continued his undercover life. Every day he endured humiliation from employees who treated him like nothing. Every night he wrote in his journal, filling page after page with evidence. His body ached from the labor, but the real pain was emotional, knowing his closest ally had turned traitor. At times the urge to rip off his disguise and confront Thomas burned fiercely within him. He imagined storming into the boardroom, unmasking himself, and watching their smug faces collapse in shock. But he knew it was too soon. Without undeniable proof, Thomas would twist the story, painting Richard as paranoid or unstable. Timing was everything. One evening, while scrubbing the floors outside a meeting room, he overheard Thomas and Mark discussing their final phase. Within weeks, they planned to present false documents to the board, ousting Richard under claims of mismanagement. His empire would fall into their hands unless he acted. The stakes had never been higher. The knowledge nearly broke him. He slumped against his mop, despair threatening to overwhelm him. The betrayal was not just business, it was personal. These were men he had mentored, trusted, and raised into power. Now they sharpened knives for his back. The weight of loneliness pressed harder than ever before. But even in despair, Richard found a spark of resolve. Sarah's kindness, Emily's sharp instincts, and the quiet dignity of unseen workers reminded him what he was fighting for. He could not give in. He would endure humiliation a little longer, gather the last pieces of evidence, and when the time came, he would strike with the full force of truth. Richard knew the time for observation was ending. Weeks of careful notes, secret recordings, and gathered documents had built his case. Now it was time to set the trap. As George the janitor, he quietly placed small recorders in meeting rooms where Thomas and Mark often plotted. Every careless word they spoke was captured, every plan preserved. The walls of the company became his silent witnesses. He also enlisted the quiet trust of Emily, who had grown increasingly certain that George was more than he seemed. Without revealing his full identity, he asked her to help safeguard key files and verify suspicious transactions. Though hesitant, Emily agreed, moved by his sincerity. She didn't know she was protecting her CEO, only that she was defending truth. Each night, Richard reviewed the evidence, building a case too strong to deny. Offshore accounts, falsified invoices, manipulated board reports, every thread pointed back to Thomas as the mastermind. Richard's heart ached with betrayal, but his resolve grew harder than steel. The downfall of Thomas would be swift and undeniable. To spring the trap, Richard scheduled a surprise board meeting, officially announced by Thomas himself. The irony was perfect. Thomas thought he was arranging Richard's downfall, unaware he was walking into his own destruction. Richard prepared both as George and as the CEO, his dual lives soon to collide in one explosive revelation. On the eve of the meeting, Richard stood alone in the darkened office, his mop in hand. The disguise that had weighed heavily on him now felt like armor. Tomorrow, George would disappear and Richard Hale would return not as a blind leader, but as a man armed with the truth. The stage was set for unmasking. The boardroom was tense as executives gathered, their polished suits hiding nervous energy. Thomas stood at the head of the table, brimming with confidence. He began his presentation, displaying charts that painted Richard as negligent and incompetent. Whispers rippled through the room as the seeds of doubt were carefully sown. Richard, still disguised as George, stood silently in the corner, mop in hand. At the peak of Thomas's speech, Richard's voice cut through the silence. "Interesting numbers," he said, dropping the janitor's rasp and revealing his true tone. The room froze as all eyes turned toward the humble figure by the wall. Slowly, Richard removed his glasses, straightened his posture, and shed the mask. Gasps filled the room as George vanished, and Richard Hale stood revealed. Thomas stumbled, his confidence faltering. This is absurd," he stammered. But Richard was prepared. He revealed the recordings, documents, and proof gathered over weeks of labor. The board members leaned forward in shock as the conspiracy unraveled before them. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal was laid bare in undeniable clarity. Mark tried to object, but Richard silenced him with a single look. "You thought I was blind," he said coldly. "But I saw more as a janitor than I ever did as CEO." The words struck like a hammer, exposing not just their crimes, but their arrogance. The boardroom shifted, loyalty snapping back to the man who had built the empire. By the end of the meeting, Thomas and his allies were stripped of power, their corruption exposed beyond repair. Richard stood tall, no longer the invisible janitor, but not the same CEO he had been before. The room that once echoed with betrayal now filled with silence, heavy with the weight of truth revealed. The unmasking was complete. In the days following the unmasking, the company trembled with shock. Executives whispered in hallways, unsure of what the future would hold. The corrupt leaders had been removed, their names tarnished and their power stripped away. Yet amidst the chaos, Richard stood firm, determined to rebuild the foundation of his empire. This was not the end, it was a rebirth. His first act was to reward loyalty where it had quietly lived. Sarah, the intern who had shown kindness when no one else did, was promoted into a permanent position. Emily, whose instincts had nearly uncovered his secret, was given greater responsibility and recognition. For Richard, honoring them was more than gratitude, it was a statement of values. The workforce, once divided by arrogance and hierarchy, began to change. Richard implemented new policies that emphasized respect for every employee, from executives to janitors. He demanded a culture where dignity was not determined by title, but by humanity. Slowly, the walls of distrust began to crumble, replaced by cautious hope. Richard himself was changed, the weeks spent as George had stripped him of illusions and shown him the truth. Leadership was not about command from above, but about seeing and valuing those below. He walked the halls now not as a distant figure, but as a man who had lived among his workers, who understood their struggles firsthand. Yet even as peace settled over the company, Richard knew the battle for integrity was never truly over. Greed and ambition would always lurk in the shadows, waiting for weakness. But he no longer feared them. With truth as his shield and humility as his strength, Richard Hale stepped into a new era of leadership, one built not on fear but on respect. In the end, Richard discovered that true power isn't found in titles or wealth, but in how we treat those we think no one is watching. Remember this: respect costs nothing, but it can change everything. Richard's journey reminds us that respect costs nothing, yet it can change everything. What about you? Have you ever experienced kindness in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you can keep walking with us through tales that move the heart and mind.